Don't watch this movie. What I thought about Funny Games, 1997. Dearest viewer, I write to you today telling you not to watch this movie. Not just because it's a graphic and realistic portrayal of human suffering at the hands of random, unpredictable violence, but also because you might get bored. And that isn't to say it's some sort of criticism, the movie does it on purpose. It chastises the viewer, breaking the fourth wall in a scant few moments to remind the viewer of exactly what they're watching, and more or less asking the audience what they're getting out of the experience on screen. It was the first movie I've ever seen in my entire lifetime of being a so-and-so quote-unquote film buff that had the main antagonists drop out at 40 minutes into the film before the movie was over just because they themselves got bored with what they were doing. I'm not going to sit here and recite the entire plot of the movie to you. Well, I kind of will. I'm going to give you a basic series of events, a synopsis, and highlight some moments that I found interesting before I get back to talking about the film as a whole and the narrative it presents, the questions it asks the viewer. And of course, I did say don't watch this movie, but maybe you want to. I've already spoiled a little bit of it, but maybe this kind of odd pseudo-avant-garde horror experience is something you enjoy. Although they are absolutely nothing alike, the closest thing I can liken it to is Skinamarink, in the sense that the horror aspects aren't supposed to be fun, it's just a movie that makes you feel uncomfortable and bad, and that's the point. It's like sitting on a soggy, dilapidated couch and trying to sleep on it on purpose. On some level, there is a kind of thrill that you'd expect in a typical horror movie, but 90% of the results of the thrill, the horror, the actual violence, more or less happens entirely off-screen. So if you think you can handle it, go watch it. And on that note, you can watch the 1997 original version with subtitles, or you can watch the 2007 version that's in English. It is literally the same movie, shot for shot, with different actors, although I prefer the 1997 version myself. It's not for everyone, you don't have to, but it might make it more interesting for you to sit through and form your own opinions on the strange narrative the movie presents before you come back to this video. Even if my observations sound like criticisms, I still think it was worth watching to some degree, but I also happen to be an individual that likes uncomfortable, odd, off-kilter media. So, you have been warned. This is the last time I'll give any sort of spoiler warning, and I am now going to directly expunge the film's events and themes. If you think you're better off not watching the movie, or if you just want a refresher, I will now provide the synopsis. I promise there's more to the video. You can skip this section if you've already seen it and have good memory. Or if you just don't care. A family goes on vacation. A father, George, a mother, Anna, and their child, Georgie. When they arrive, they are accosted by what seems to be fellow vacationers, Peter and Paul. What seems like a minor annoyance as Peter asks for eggs quickly spirals into a traumatic event as the two men hold the family hostage, crippling the father with a golf club, on top of harassing and toying with them under the constant threat of violence. What follows is a series of uncomfortable quote-unquote games, although there aren't very many actual games to speak of. They test the golf clubs by using them to maim the family's dog Rolfie, makes Anna play a hot or cold game to find the dog's body. A boat arrives, neighbors saying hello. Anna has to pretend everything is fine, and tells them that they can come home for dinner tomorrow, and they leave off. It's around this time where the concept of a bet is introduced. Paul describes a bet of whether or not the family will still be alive by tomorrow, or more specifically, 9 in the morning. There aren't any actual stakes involved, just purely whether or not the family is dead by tomorrow. Then there are a few more games, which are, of course, just sadistic exercises. The antagonists put a sack on Georgie's head and make the wife undress and then dress back up. No overt sexual assault is committed other than this scene's uncomfortable tone. They harass the family, making light of the situation, until eventually the kid escapes, running out of the house, frantically going in any direction he can to get help. He arrives at the neighbor's house, different neighbors from earlier, but what seem to be family friends, only to find that they're already dead. Georgie spends a lot of time hiding, eventually finds a shotgun. The pursuer arrives, but when he tries to shoot him, he finds the gun unloaded, and is promptly returned back to the house. Now, the whole family is once again back in the living room. Paul decides to play a counting out game in order to randomly decide which member of the family gets shot with the shotgun. Paul puts Peter in charge, goes to the kitchen to make a sandwich. We hear Peter counting in the background, but suddenly, in the middle of the camera still being focused on Paul preparing his meal, we hear a shotgun blast. Turns out, the kid panicked and tried to run, again, which made Peter shoot him. We never see it happen, just like all the other violence in the film so far, it happens completely off camera, but as the camera pans back to the room, we do see the body. Other than the blood, there's no strong gore present in the film, but it is clearly supposed to be Georgie laying in front of a bloody television. Paul gets upset with Peter, saying he shouldn't have been so quick to shoot, says something along the lines of there being no point in staying now because they wouldn't get as much out of it, and they leave. What follows is possibly one of the most stomach-turning scenes in a movie I've ever seen. We don't follow the antagonists out, they simply leave, and effectively leave the movie completely out of the blue for this point in time. There isn't even a result to the game they were playing earlier. The kid just gets shot, and we're left with the same static camera view of the living room lingering. This is about an hour into the movie. The antagonists just leave, and we sit here about 12 full minutes of mostly nothing but the absolutely gut-wrenching sound of the mother crying, before she hobbles over to the TV, turns it off, and tries to help the father walk into the kitchen. The whole scene is played straight. It's the worst scene in the movie in the sense that it's the hardest to watch. Just an extended, overtly realistic and straightforward depiction of a mother coping with the sudden loss of her child after what could have been hours of torture. Then we have like 15 or 20 minutes of them just speaking, trying to figure out what they're going to do next, where to get help, how, what to expect. They make a game plan, fully knowing that Paul and Peter could still be out there somewhere, and they could come back at any moment. The wife attempts to get help, flagging down a random car on the road. We cut back to the house as the father drapes cloth over his child. We're with the father for a moment before what may be the most sinister scene in the film, more so than anything we've seen so far. The single moment that filled me with dread the most to accompany the most depressing moment in the film just prior. The father hears the door open and close and movement. The audience is on the edge of their seat. It could be anything. Bad guys could be back. Maybe another neighbor investigate the noise. Maybe Anna's back with police, help, anyone. And as the father stares at the open doorway, we get essentially his point of view. Initially, nobody walks into frame, and instead a golf ball bounces into view through the open door. The same golf ball pocketed by Paul earlier from the same golf club bag at the beginning of the movie. When I saw this scene, my heart dropped, and it was at this moment I had abandoned all hope. Much like Paul apprehending the kid earlier, there's no fanfare, no jump scare, no sinister music in the background. The movie doesn't need to do anything other than just let us watch. Paul and Peter walk back into the home, dragging the apprehended wife back inside, and now they're on the couch again, and there's one more game. They do the random counting again, and this time complete the game landing on the husband, marking him as the next to die. Paul gives Anna a choice. Does she want to take his place? But George chimes in first, just saying to get it over with. So Paul continues trying to play a game and tries to make Anna decide again, do they kill Georgie with a gun or a knife? And when Anna refuses to decide, they injure the husband, simply injuring him with the knife, so she complies. Paul makes her recite a prayer, and if she recites it fully, she can decide and theoretically choose the gun in order to make George's suffering quicker. But near the end of the prayer, she lunges for the shotgun, grabbing it and blasting a hole through Peter's stomach before Paul can react. Paul panics, grabbing the gun from her and searching frantically for the TV remote, and then presses rewind, which rewinds the film to the beginning of him explaining the prayer game to Anna. And the next time she lunges for the gun, Paul is quick enough to take it before Anna has the chance to fire it. Paul notes that Anna has broken the rules, so they kill George with the gun. Then they lead Anna out to a boat, taking her along for the ride, bound by ropes. It looks like she's managed to smuggle a knife into her hands and begins to try cutting her ropes, but it's quickly pointed out by the two men and taken. Then Paul notes the time, 8 in the morning, 1 hour before the conclusion of the bet mentioned near the start of the movie. Then with no fanfare, casually pushes Anna into the water with her limbs bound by rope, presumably leaving her to drown. The movie ends with the two men sailing until they arrive at the back door of the neighbors that Anna, George, and Georgie were supposed to meet for dinner. Peter asks if they have any eggs. Paul gives a knowing look to the camera as blaring music plays in the background, freeze framing on Paul's unflinching stare. And that's it. The cycle of torture is seemingly going to be perpetuated on another family. Nothing happens to the bad guys. None of the protagonists are alive. It's basically just pure torture with no satisfying or conclusive ending. So,
What the hell was that?
what the hell was that, right? What makes this film good or interesting in spite of what sounds like an awful plot that goes nowhere on paper? And what, if anything, was the point? Let's talk about it in no particular order. Here's a few things that stuck with me days, weeks, months after watching the film. Jump scares that don't happen. There aren't a lot of these per se, but as an avid slasher and horror fan, I'm incredibly trained to read tense situations. I'm conditioned to see faces and shadows and brace my beating heart for the inevitable pop-out and get-you moments that are such an avid component of typical horror media. But this movie just didn't have them. It was tense, incredibly so, but not in the sense that it actually felt like it was building up to anything. It was just uncomfortable. A family being held hostage on a couch didn't feel like I was waiting for a big boom moment, a sudden cut, a shrill or loud noise, a payoff. It makes you expect catharsis that never comes, and when something does happen, it just happens. No thriller chord stab, no intense pop-out camera angle, nothing. You're just faced with the crushing reality of the situation. All of its tension felt like an uncomfortable conversation, one you'd have with a coworker you don't particularly like but can't shoo off, a long drawn-out one-sided social interaction with an elderly family member that's putting you to sleep, but you also can't walk away from due to societal convention. It wasn't tense in a way that was scary, it was tense in a way that was off-putting and a little boring. It felt like I was trying to sleep on a lumpy couch and couldn't quite distinguish the nightmares I was having from reality. There's a few moments, long shots, things that are a bit more drawn out than they should be. Specific moments come to mind. The beginning, the conversation in the kitchen before everything really goes to shit. It's uncomfortable. Peter awkwardly asks for eggs, breaks them, the phone falls in the sink. Before they actually decide to commit to the first act of violence, the whole thing just feels like a typical awkward interaction, like one you'd have in a foreign country because you don't quite understand the social cues. It's overtly sinister. By the time Peter knocks the phone into the sink, the audience is already clued in. I know this is a horror movie, they're clearly setting up, but even after they've already struck the father with the golf club, they're still so awkwardly casual about the whole thing. There's no jump scare. Even the first act of actual human violence committed on screen gets nothing. It just happens and then everyone reacts to it. The family, throughout Peter and Paul's torture, somehow still feel like bystanders to their own nightmare. They rarely make any attempt to fight back beyond just asking them to leave. And it's not a writing issue, it's uncomfortably realistic. There are a lot of people that think they would be the Punisher when faced with any kind of threat, but in reality, violence is messy, unpredictable. Hate, crime, assault, murder is hard to predict and at times difficult to comprehend, especially when it's happening to you. I'd even venture to say it's entirely up to audience interpretation what the family thinks is happening during the entire intro before they're even actually starting to be held hostage. And of course, the only times they do try to fight back or do something, it's immediately cold. Georgie tries to run twice, gets found the first time, shot the second. Anna reaches for the gun and gets the shot, and then Paul literally rewinds the movie. Anna's knife at the end is taken before she can do anything with it. It's a constant red herring of hope that never comes. The movie seems to really want to drive in the fact that the victims of this story don't actually have any chance and never did. When it was released, it came out with very mixed reviews, and perhaps that's where the animosity towards the film comes from. Regardless of how the criticism is stated, the word, again, is boring. There's no jump scares, so it's boring. Nobody does anything, so it's boring. It's realistic, which is boring and sad, not thrilling. And there's more to that, but we'll touch on it later. When the kid is running through the house, trying to escape Paul's chase, he hides in darkness. At any moment, we're expecting Paul to pop out of the darkness, to grab him, yell, make some kind of big, momentous occasion of existing on screen again. Ooh, here's the bad guy. But it more or less doesn't happen. The kid hides, it's tense, of course. It builds that same intensity. But we see Paul's shadow moving under the door. We hear him walking about. But by the time the kid finds him again, he's just there. And of course, it's scary. Okay, so the kid doesn't get away. Oh no, we say, the antagonist is back on screen. The kid has failed, that's bad. But it's not presented as a jump scare, he's just there. And the gun the kid holds to defend himself, unloaded, which Paul already knows. So there's no struggle, there's no jump. Rather, all the intensity doesn't get resolved, it just debases itself. All the tension building up that normally results in a big moment just melts into the same hopelessness that permeates the rest of the film. The ball starts rolling and then melts before it gets anywhere, and it happens time and time again, just coagulating to the same miasma. To fake out, Anna runs down the road, the camera pans out a little bit, and maybe it's just me, but the entire time I'm expecting one of them to just pop out of the greenery and grab her. Maybe in some way this is just another way of putting us in the shoes of the protagonist. We have no idea where the bad men are, or if they really left, or if the entire thing is just part of the same game they were playing from the start. They could still be here around any corner, watching, stalking, waiting. Shocking things happen, but jump scares don't, and the worst of the shocking content happens entirely off-screen, which is atypical for a horror film. Now we're going to talk about Paul, who is, despite his very casual nature, still a fairly gripping antagonist. Not just because he's an evil, sadistic serial killer that's not exactly unique in the horror genre, but because he actively breaks the fourth wall and seems to be fully and totally aware that he's in a movie. Or at the very least, that there is an interested audience watching his actions as if it was a movie. I didn't draw much notice to these through the plot synopsis because I wanted to take a closer look at them in their own section here. Every time it happens, it's very intentional. Every fourth wall break is meant to communicate something else to the audience. And we'll start with the first case of it, the wink. As far as I can tell, sans any kind of dialogue meaning to be made a commentary, this is the first time Paul actually directly breaks the fourth wall. But it's done in a way that isn't overtly obvious. While he's making Anna search for the body of her deceased pet, he turns around and winks at the camera, just a little wink, a knowing one, a ha-ha, look at her, she's going to be so sad. But the audience isn't really clued in that much to what extent Paul can actually manipulate, tap, and shatter the fourth wall. There are scenes that are both fourth wall breaks of a sort and entirely in character at the same time. See, every character written to be knowledgeable about the media that they're in, like the horror buff characters in Scream or Abed from Community. So maybe he's just a sociopath trying to make his own horror movie, and it's entirely in his head. He plays things up for entertainment value, so when he turns and winks at the camera, or quote-unquote us, the viewer, we can infer that he's probably just winking at Peter behind him or the rest of Anna's family. It's not hard to make up an audience in his head. He's a psychopath. It's obviously uncomfortable. There are a lot of scenes in horror movies, jump scares specifically, that are framed in a way like it's meant more for the viewer than the actual protagonists, so we can steady ourselves with the relative benefit of doubt that Paul isn't actually addressing us as the viewers here. Of course, when you rewatch the scene later, if you ever give this movie a second glance, you come to understand how sinister it actually is, but the first time, oh, maybe that's just a joke of some kind. For first-time watcher, it's the first seed of doubt planted to continue growing a sense of confusion and disbelief. Now, the bet. Something that also seems at first like it could either be in-universe or a fourth wall audience break, betting if the victims will be alive by tomorrow. Of course, the concept itself in-universe is audacious, but from a fourth wall perspective, the bet, at very least how I interpret its use in the film, is the same bet the audience takes when watching any horror movie. As in, I've watched every Scream movie, and being an avid slasher fanatic, you come to understand that at least half the cast, if not more, will probably die by the end of the movie. So you take bets, you guess. You don't just guess who the bad guy is, you guess who's making it to the end. Isn't that part of the thrill? The movie asks you this plainly. Funny Games says to see who lives and who dies is a bit of a sadistic notion all on its own. In a way, we're put in the shoes of the characters of the film. Paul and Pete seem to want to see who gets to live, if anyone, and the family themselves also don't know if they're making it out alive. I think it plays on the gravitas of the situation. As an audience, it's thrilling. If the situation was actually happening in real life, depending on whose shoes we put ourselves in, it would either be sadistic and psychopathic from the perpetrator's perspective, or utterly mortifying knowing you could be on the chopping block from the victim's perspective. Either way, you're still making a bet. The medium that the story is told through dissipates that intensity since we're not directly involved. It's just a fictional story after all, and we're just watching it happen. But at that point, the film seems to paint the audience as accomplices. Of course, I don't really think watching slasher films makes you a killer or a psychopath yourself, which is going to be in its own section later, but it is an interesting psychological framework to watch the movie through, and one of its more interesting meta-narratives, such as, is that enough? Near the end of the film, when it's just Anna and George on the couch, George tells Paul and Peter to get it over with. You know, they've had enough. He just wants it to be over. So Paul asks Anna, is it enough? Are they done playing games? And looks directly at the camera, asking the audience if they've also had enough, while also complaining that they weren't at feature film length yet. Then he mocks the lack of plot development, goads the audience by saying they must want a proper ending, and then remarks that it can't be enough because the bet from earlier is still going on. It's not tomorrow yet. Living or dying by tomorrow isn't concluded, unable to be withdrawn, so they have to keep going. At this point, no matter how potentially disgusted or uncomfortable the audience is, if they've made it this far, they're pot committed. No one's going anywhere. They have to see the ending. Paul knows it as much as the viewer. In a way, the only way the viewer can win is by turning the movie off. And I kind of think the movie wants you to want the movie to be over. It's a unique take on providing an antagonistic figure. It makes us hate Paul every time he talks to us. This man exists through the meta-narrative just to keep the story going. The horror both comes from his actions and from the movie simply not being over yet. His existence coming back after his initial withdrawal lengthens the movie because there'd be no movie without the antagonist. The bet is still going on. I would imagine that moment is much more effective if you don't actually know how long the movie is or how long is left, which streaming sort of spoiled for me, so I guess if you do end up watching it on your own after you watch this video, maybe don't ever look at the time. It must have been a real experience watching this in theaters when it first came out. And then the rewind, which I probably have the least to say about because it's absolutely the strangest moment in the film and it's most blatant. It's almost obnoxious in execution, purposefully so. I think the point is to really make sure the audience knows, hey, don't get too hopeful. We're not going to do a happy ending here. There is no catharsis at the end of this torture rainbow. It challenges us to take the film seriously and asks us if we should care. It rewinds time in our faces, and at the end of the movie, you can't help but feel like it wasted your time. If the bad guys can't lose, and there's no hope for the good guys, then what is the point of watching the movie unless you're only watching it to see people suffer? Paul basically invents his own deus ex machina to keep the movie going. This one surreal moment sits the audience back down just as soon as they start jumping in their seats. No, 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 says the movie. We don't do that here. Sit back down and keep feeling bleak, because that is all you're getting. Now we can quickly talk about the game itself. The title of the film, Funny Games. I find it interesting that the story is centered around forcing the protagonist to play games, whether successful or unsuccessful, given that this movie released in 1997, and there has been so much horror media since then that features death games as a sort of central plot device. Horror as a genre has leaned more and more into thrilling who lives, who dies narratives, presented through almost a gamified context. Squid Games, of course. And we as an audience are obsessed with games, watching people play games, gamifying our entire lives, watching people on TV who normally live paycheck to paycheck win sports cars on a game show. Something, Black Mirror Season 1, Episode 2, 15 million merits. Gamifying anything, even within a rigged system, helps you digest it. It's easier to make a horrible thing make sense if you add a lot of numbers and buttons to it. I don't think there was meant to be a lot of commentary on the concept of games in this sense, but it is something I noticed. Was this movie maybe predicting the future of horror media and the desensitization towards awful things? Or did it just accidentally tie this narrative into the film's original concept? Maybe there was already enough general animosity towards the concept of horror films supposedly turning human suffering into thriller content around the time the movie was released that Funny Games already worked as a title. I don't know, I just thought it was kind of neat. So, after all that, what's the point? What's the point of the movie? Well, that's kind of a hard question to ask. The movie seems to chide or judge the audience for watching it, but they still spent a lot of time and money making it. Should we also judge the director, actors, camera operators, everyone involved in its production? To be honest, it's kind of hard to tell. I don't think the movie outright wants to villainize people who consume horror-related content. It's just a series of vague questions and eyebrow raises and wiggles at the viewer. Maybe the question is more, how much worse can it get before it becomes too difficult for you to separate this fiction from reality? Like, how far can we push the bar before what we're producing becomes unacceptable? But if that's the case, I feel like they could have done a whole lot worse. All the worst stuff in the movie happens off screen, and there's plenty of intentionally disgusting and transgressive films out there that are much worse than Funny Games. I mean, Cannibal Holocaust released 17 years before Funny Games was even a concept, so they definitely could have upped the dial if they wanted to. What's the point? The question itself is kind of a hard sell. The movie feels aimless at times. But I suppose that could also be the point, as senseless violence isn't nearly as thrilling or sensational as films portray it to be. And when does it get more typically thrilling? When Peter is shot? So the audience is still cheering on a murder, just one that's easier to agree with, so how desensitized are we to violence? If the aim of the movie was truly to attack the spectator, any criticism wrought upon the audience for choosing to pay money to watch it, or simply just watching it in the age of streaming, any of that criticism, any of that attack could be just as worthy of being tacked onto the director, the writer for making it. Maybe it's just too audience aggressive and boring to watch. Maybe the lack of real progression or direction or meaning is part of why I struggle to recommend it to anyone, on top of the already hard to digest contents of the film itself. What's the point in watching a movie that doesn't like you for watching it? Well, I suppose I watched the movie for the same reason I finished Spec Ops: The Line, for the same reason I continued playing Lisa the Painful after I realized that was a game that hated the player. I think things that challenge you are fun, both in a sense of a game's difficulty, but also challenging the player or viewer psychologically. What can we take? What are we able to digest? What are we willing to sit through to say that we finished a film or beat a game? It's entertainment, of course, but I typically find media that challenges my own entertainment of itself to be a consistently unique and fun experience. What's the point? We could always just ask the director. I don't like violence, says filmmaker Michael Haneke, and I don't like horror movies. I would never do a thriller or horror film for the sake of doing it, and I would say that Funny Games is a self-reflexive anti-horror film. It's a criticism of violence because that makes me angry. Well, Michael, my response is twofold. The first response is, you still made the fucking violent horror movie, so hey, maybe a little hypocritical, okay? And the premise of a movie that insults the viewer for watching it doesn't seem very transgressive, it just seems pretentious. The second response, alternatively, is, wow, that's a unique premise. You challenged and displayed your distaste for something by creating a film that represents the worst parts about it. That is a unique and interesting viewpoint and lens to write and produce a film through. I believe in both of these things at the same time. He goes on to say in the same interview, I'm always attacking something, because to make a film I have to be angry. I need to be shocked by something so that I can make a story about it. In that quote, I don't condemn nor do I condone, but I will say I understand. And if we're talking plainly, I guess the main question is, should we judge horror movies? Or, paraphrase, should we find a moral distaste in horror movies being produced and or judge people who go out of their way to view them? Well, to find any kind of thrill or enjoyment in any way regarding depictions of human suffering simply must be wrong, right? Is it not a moral obligation, and especially Puritan one, to disavow these types of films from being created, distributed, viewed? People seem to get the idea that the message of the film is that movie-going audiences should feel bad for enjoying fictional depictions of violence. While I haven't watched the more recent Terrifier films. I only saw the short film. I remember when the last movie came out, I think Terrifier 3 sparked a lot of Twitter threads which contained the typical arguments that mainly boil down to, I don't like horror media, or how this movie depicted its gore and violence, which means you're a bad person for watching it. Are these same half-baked, slow-roasted ideas the thoughts and driving factor behind making funny games? And is that line of thought even valid to have? Because, well, I'm an opinionated person. I think the same argument against content deemed problematic or too morally dubious to justify its own existence is rooted in a misguided and entirely dumb, one-dimensional, puritanistic view. You can come up with whatever reason you want to dislike fictional media because it depicts things modern society thinks is bad, such as killing, violence of any nature, or so on, perhaps even depicting them in ways you personally find distasteful or disagree with. Much the same, we should ban Grand Theft Auto games from being created or sold because they make impressionable young gamers into violent criminals.
Philanthropist Early Walker says violent video games like Grand Theft Auto could be influencing their young minds.
Rock and roll is the devil's music and will turn you into a Satanist.
I'm here to address the issue of a possible rating system in the recording industry. Labeling records where excesses of explicit sex or graphic violence have occurred, and furthermore references to drugs and alcohol or the occult are included in the lyrics.
We should all wear funny hats and stand in a circle to burn books we don't like. Okay, maybe that's a little extreme. Maybe you're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, well, I just don't get it. How could someone sit there and enjoy sensationalized violence? Or even realistic depictions of it? Even if it's completely fictional, fabricated content, what joy is there in human suffering? But I think that misses the point. Usually in horror movies, when people or the protagonist are shown suffering, we're not supposed to revel in it. We don't take the side of the killer. It's supposed to scare us. It's supposed to shock us. It's supposed to play on the empathy we already have for others. Otherwise there would be no horror. If we can't feel bad about the bad things we're seeing happen on screen, there's no point in producing horror media. Every time someone dies, it ups the thrill, the human instinct, the biological instinct to survive. We want the final girl. We want the protagonist to escape. And if we're lucky, they'll get a shot at the killer and take him down for good. Bad things still happen, but there's a conclusion. There's an ending catharsis. Funny games intentionally presented none of this, which arguably makes it a bad representation of actual typical horror film, and in choosing not to present the enjoyable elements of one, fails as a living criticism of the horror genre. Even if it still serves perfectly well as a psychological horror in its own way, you get what I'm saying. Maybe that's why I like slashers so much. I love Scream, Chucky, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, good kills. I marvel at the effects, the personality, the charm, the character, and usually the bad guy at the end always dies, or is at least defeated. Seeing how the protagonist makes it out of this one is part of the fun too, just as much as taking bets on who else gets to make it to the end of the film. But even movies without that, pure tragedies, films that depict suffering for the sake of it, well, that's harder to find an audience for. It's certainly not for everyone, and that's completely understandable. But reveling in every possible facet of the human condition through fictional media is both a hallmark of human storytelling ever since we started telling stories, and also, importantly, something possible in fictional media that isn't possible in reality. The idea, the opportunity to explore different parts of the human psyche without anyone actually being harmed or going through these traumatic events. Some horror movies are challenging. That's the point. If we're to disavow horror movies for depicting any sort of suffering, then where exactly do we draw the line? Should we cut arguments out of television because nobody wants to see people arguing or displaying negative thoughts? That's bad emotions. Or in other fictional media, a more extreme example, Darth Vader has killed a lot of people. He even does it on screen sometimes, but killing is bad, right? So we should ban Star Wars. In fact, it has war in the name, and war, as we all know, is a bad thing. You know, I quite enjoyed Saving Private Ryan. I thought it was a great movie. But people die in that movie in ways that are realistic and made me feel sad, so we should ban that movie too. It's not just that this line of thinking is a slippery slope, it's purely the logical conclusion of wanting to disavow horror movies from existing. This typical Halloween slasher offended sensibility, so now nobody gets to watch it because you didn't like it, and it made you feel bad in a way that you couldn't separate fictional content from reality. You weren't strong enough to simply ignore content that wasn't for you, and now it's a problem, and you'll choose to make it everybody else's problem. Here's a tip: don't do that. This is, in totality, how I feel about anything labeled problematic, degenerate, or other buzzword media. Fictional stories exist in some manner so we can explore the human psyche. Having empathy for fictional characters, especially in a realistic setting and story structure, is completely normal, and it's kind of the point, right? But being incapable of separating these fictional characters and stories from reality is not normal. The fact of the matter is, you have to curate your own fictional media experience. When you don't like something, you don't watch it and you don't seek it out, and you especially don't intentionally seek it out so you can get even angrier about it when you see more of it. Don't rage bait yourself. Typically, horror films are categorized under horror because they're meant to horrify you. Some people find entertainment in this and some don't. I don't like to ride roller coasters because they make my insides feel like painful jello, but I don't try to push for the destruction of theme parks. So if you're the kind of person that doesn't like horror movies, you don't watch them. That's the trick, and you don't go out of your way to make a horror movie about how you don't like horror movies while also ignoring every good part you expect to see in horror movies. If you make a self-critical horror film without any of the trademarks found in popular horror culture, then maybe you aren't making a horror movie and you just wanted to jerk yourself off about how morally superior you are, while ironically making a movie that depicts suffering in a way that's intentionally more realistic and uncomfortable than films in the same genre. At that point, you're missing the point. You're trying to fight fire with propane. Some people can handle the heat and some people have to get out of the kitchen. The last thing we're going to do is let either side try and remove the kitchen entirely because the stove is too hot. Let people cook. If you don't like the food, don't fucking eat it. Final thoughts. It wasn't overtly thrilling or interesting. It was a depiction of a family experiencing random violence told in a realistic format. The bad guys have no comeuppance. It doesn't teach us a lesson. It is a strange and delirious, surreal series of bad events that serves no purpose other than to depict suffering and in some way ask us if we really want to watch it happen. Is it a bit hypocritical? Maybe. Am I gonna watch it again? No. Did it make me think? Yes. Enough to justify watching it in the first place. Should you watch it? Well, probably not. Do I think any less of the director for making it? No. I still think it's an interesting premise, viewpoint, and concept for a movie. Do I think it was a good movie? Ironically, yes. At the end of the day, it was still an experience, but that doesn't mean that it's worth your time. Lizard_Jesus1 3 years ago spoke on the movie, writing in a Reddit comment, "I love it because I love being spat on." And that is all there is to say about Funny Games, 1997. Something that also at first seems like it could be it could either be in Lizard_Jesus1 3 years ago spoke on the movie, writing in a Reddit comment, "I love it because I damn it."